Imagine, your ship sinks in the middle of the ocean, and somehow you survive. Along with hundreds of others, you make it onto a bare stretch of coral reef. The worst seems to be over.
Instead of helping each other,
One of the survivors decides he gets to choose who lives and who dies. Over the next few months, his men will kill more than 100 men, women, and children, their own shipmates. This isn't fiction. It's documented history. This is the story of the ship Batavia, a story all of Europe once knew, and almost nobody remembers today. By the end of this video, you'll know why. Let's go back a year, to the day this ship first left port. In 1628, the Dutch East India Company was the largest trading corporation on the planet. That's not an exaggeration. It had its own fleet, its own army, the right to declare war and mint currency. But behind those numbers, ordinary people boarded these ships every year, and not all of them made it.
Batavia was built in 1628 as the flagship of one of the company's 3 annual fleets, 45 meters long, carrying around 30 guns, one of the most powerful ships of its time. On October 29th, she left the island of Texel, bound for a city on the other side of the world that shared her name, Batavia, modern-day Jakarta. On board were 341 people, soldiers, sailors, passengers, women, and children, and a massive cargo of silver and gold for the spice trade. The voyage was commanded by Francisco Pelsart, the company's senior merchant, the man in charge, at least on paper. But there was a second man whose decisions the crew's lives actually depended on. Skipper Arjen Jacobs, in charge of navigation. Between these two men, there was already bad blood. A year earlier, at a port on the other side of the route, Pelsart had publicly humiliated Jacobs, who'd gotten drunk and insulted him in front of witnesses. Jacobs hadn't forgotten. There was a third man on board, too, one nobody considered important yet. Geronimus Cornelisz, a junior merchant, wasn't heading to the Indies to build a career. He was running. A bankrupt apothecary from Haarlem, ruined the year before after his infant son died of syphilis. Tangled up in a heresy case with an artist he knew, Cornelisz was fleeing possible arrest, all the way to the other side of the world. On paper, just another passenger. In reality, a man with nothing left to lose. 3 men on one ship. One humiliated and bitter. One ruined and broken. One convinced he was in charge. That combination would kill more people than the storm about to sink their ship. After the Cape of Good Hope, where the fleet stopped to resupply, Jacobson and Cornelisz started talking to each other more than they should have. The plan they were building was simple and greedy. Split Batavia off from the rest of the fleet, seize the ship and its cargo of gold and silver, and start a new life as pirates, somewhere far from Dutch law. According to Pelsart's own account, Jacobs began quietly steering the ship away from the other vessels, always with some navigational excuse ready. Before long, a small group of sympathetic sailors had gathered around the 2 conspirators. But they needed a reason. An open mutiny with no cause would turn too many people against them. So Cornelisz and Jacobs came up with something else. Provoke Pelsart into punishing someone unfairly, and let the outraged crew take their side on its own. They chose a young passenger named Lucretia Jans. One night,
a group of men attacked and assaulted her, counting on the scandal to push Pelsart into publicly whipping one of the innocent sailors. The plan was cruel, calculated, and built on the assumption that the attackers would never be identified.
It partly worked. Lucretia was too shaken to identify her attackers with any certainty, and the conspirators went unpunished. But the whipping they were counting on never happened either. Pelsart handled it more carefully than they expected.
The plot never came to light. It just hung there, unfinished. Jacobs and Cornelisz still wanted the ship. They still had no excuse. All they needed was to wait for the right moment.
The sea decided not to wait. The company's sailing instructions laid out a route called the Brower route. Sail east, much farther south than seems wise, catching the latitudes sailors called the Roaring Forties for their relentless westerly gales, then turn sharply north toward Indonesia. Without a reliable way to measure longitude, captains judged the turning point mostly by feel. Get it wrong, and you'd sail straight into the uncharted west coast of Australia.
On the night of June 4th, 1629, Batavia got it wrong.
The ship slammed into a reef that would later be named Morning Reef, part of the Houtman Abrolhos, a chain of coral islands hundreds of kilometers from the nearest inhabited shore. Storm, darkness, the hull tearing apart. People jumped into the water in a panic, unable to see where safety even was in the pitch black. By morning, around 40 people were dead. Some drowned immediately. Others didn't survive the night, clinging to the wreckage.
The rest, roughly 300 people, including every woman and child aboard, made it to the nearest scraps of land by longboat and yawl. Not islands in any real sense, bare limestone outcrops barely poking above the water, without a single tree, without any shelter from the sun.
A search of the nearby islets turned up the same result everywhere. Nothing. No stream, no puddle, not a hint of fresh water. Just sea lions dozing on the rocks, and birds that could be eaten if you could catch them.
For 300 people, including infants, that was a death sentence with a few days' delay. Without water under a blazing sun, people die faster than they do from hunger.
Pelsart had one option left. The mainland, Australia, lay a couple dozen kilometers to the east. Maybe there was water there. Maybe from there someone could reach civilization and send help.
He couldn't take everyone. Pelsart made his decision. Part of the group would go with him to search for water and help. The rest would stay behind on the bare islands and would have to survive on what little they had until help returned.
Pelsart, Jacobs, a few senior officers, and part of the crew set out into the open ocean in a small boat, searching for fresh water. Landings on the Australian coast turned up nothing. That shore was just as dry as the islands they'd left behind.
There was only one real option left: sail north, all the way to Batavia, the city that shared the wrecked ship's name, modern-day Jakarta, and bring back help. The journey took 33 days in an open boat on a rough ocean. Not one day passed without the risk that the next big wave would capsize them. There was barely enough fresh water for a sip, let alone a full cup. No shelter from the sun. No guarantee land would even appear where they expected it. Again and again, it seemed like the coast was about to appear. Again and again, There was nothing on the horizon but water. They all survived. A rare piece of luck in a story that has given its people almost nothing else. When they reached Batavia, the wheels of justice turned fast, just not in the right direction. The boatswain was arrested and executed for an earlier disciplinary offense from before the wreck. Jacobses was also taken into custody for negligent navigation, though nobody suspected his real role in planning the mutiny yet. The company's governor-general, Jan Pieterzoon Koen, didn't waste time. Pelsart was immediately given command of the ship Sardam and ordered to sail back, rescue the survivors, and recover what cargo he could. The return trip took over a month, then nearly as long again, just to find those same islands among hundreds of similar-looking dots in the ocean. Meanwhile, on the islands, where almost 300 people had been left behind, time was moving very differently. Geronimus Cornelisz wasn't a sailor or a soldier. He nearly drowned in the wreck himself, spending 2 days clinging to debris before he washed up on one of the islets. But by rank, within the company's hierarchy, he was the highest-ranking man left, and that was enough to make people start listening to him. The first thing Cornelisz did was have all the weapons and remaining supplies gathered in one place, under his control. Officially, it was for order and fair distribution. In reality, it meant no one could challenge his word by force. Then he sent a group of about 20 soldiers, led by a man named Wiebbe Hayes, to a neighboring island to search for fresh water. It looked like a reasonable precaution. In truth, Cornelisz was counting on Hayes's men dying of hunger and thirst on an empty patch of land, getting rid of 20 potential opponents in one move. Hayes, with no idea what his commander was counting on, led his men off to search for water, not yet knowing that the decision he'd soon have to make would demand something he'd never trained for, choosing whether to risk his own men for people he'd never even met. The same order, given out of a cold wish to get rid of extra mouths to feed, would soon become the only chance at survival left to anyone on these islands. Cornelisz never killed anyone with his own hands. He never once raised a sword. His only attempt at direct involvement was trying to poison an infant, the child of a woman named Macon Cardos, with laudanum. The poison didn't fully work, and on his orders, one of his men, a terrified clerk named Salomon Deschamps, strangled the dying baby instead. Macon herself was killed later, by other men loyal to Cornelisz. In everything else, he worked through others, persuading, manipulating, framing every killing as necessary, or as punishment for imagined theft. At first, the logic was almost rational as murder can be. Fewer mouths meant the meager supplies would last longer. Cornelisz openly said he wanted to cut the number of survivors down to around 45. But according to accounts that survive through Pelsart's own journal, that logic stopped being necessary very quickly. People who'd started killing on command kept killing simply because they'd gotten used to it.
Cornelius's inner circle, the men he trusted to kill in his name, got a visible mark of that trust too. Bright red clothing trimmed with gold braid, stripped from the trunks of dead passengers. What was looted from the dead became a badge for the few who now got to decide who died next.
The exact death toll is disputed. Sources put it at no fewer than 110, with some estimates as high as 125, including women and children. Among the dead was Bastien Giesberts, one of the few whose name even survives in the record. Most of the other victims remain in the sources, simply a number. A handful of women were kept alive by Cornelisz and his men as concubines. Among them was Lucretia Jans, the same woman who'd once been used as a pretext for mutiny back on the ship in a staged attack. That had been theater. This wasn't.
On the island, she had no say in anything. Where she lived, who she shared a tent with, whether she'd live to see morning. All of it was decided by men, one of whom had already shown he'd kill for almost no reason at all. The woman they couldn't use as an excuse for mutiny at sea became currency in a mutiny on land, on an island where the only real choice belonged to one man.
Everyone left in Cornelius's camp lived in constant fear, not of nature or hunger, but of not knowing if they'd see morning. And a couple of kilometers away, on the scrap of land they'd been sent to die on, Wiebbe Hayes and his men were starting to find chances Cornelisz had never counted on. The island Hayes's men had been sent to turned out to be less hopeless than Cornelisz had planned. There was fresh water there, a small but real spring, and there were wallabies, small marsupials that could be hunted and eaten.
Instead of dying of hunger and thirst as planned, Hayes's group survived. Before long, fragments of news about what was happening in Cornelius's camp began reaching them, through escapees, through signals, through rumors that spread between the islands. Hayes made a decision Cornelisz could never have predicted. Instead of simply staying out of it, his men began preparing to defend themselves. They built a crude fort out of limestone blocks and coral debris, a ring of walls on a bare island, a fortification that shouldn't have existed at all. Those walls are still standing. Nearly 400 years later, Wiebbe Hayes' fort on West Wallaby Island remains the oldest European structure in Australia, built by the hands of men their own commander had sent there to die. Cornelisz knew a rescue ship would come for the survivors eventually, and he had a plan. Seize it first, turn the remaining survivors to his side, or get rid of them. Take the gold and silver from Batavia's wreck, and sail off as a pirate. Hayes's men, dug in on the neighboring island, stood between him and that plan. Cornelisz's men tried to storm the fort twice. Twice they were driven back, with rocks, makeshift spears made from wreckage, and the raw desperation of defenders who had nothing left to lose. The third assault was meant to be the one that decided it. Both sides understood. Either the fort fell, or it was over for the mutineers. In the middle of that fight, with the outcome still undecided, a sail appeared on the horizon.
Sardam. Pelsart was back.
Instead of just waiting to see how the battle ended, Hayes ran for the shore, racing to reach the new arrivals before Cornelisz's men could. He made it. He warned Pelsart about what had happened on the islands and about the mutineers' plan to seize the rescue ship itself. The difference between rescue and disaster for everyone still alive came down to minutes.
Bringing every suspect back to Batavia for trial was too dangerous. Too many mutineers, too little security, too long a voyage. Pelsart held a tribunal right there on the islands, fast and brutal, under the harsh Dutch law of the time, with interrogations under torture.
Geronimus Cornelius and at least 6 of his closest men had their hands cut off, then were hanged on the very islands where they'd committed their crimes. It became the first legal execution of Europeans on Australian soil.
2 junior participants in the massacre, convicted of lesser crimes, a soldier named Wouter Loos and a cabin boy named Jan Pelgrim de Baai, escaped the noose. Instead of execution, they were put ashore on the Australian mainland at the mouth of the Hutt River and left there. They became the first known Europeans to remain living in Australia.
What happened to them afterward, nobody knows. They were never heard from again.
12 chests of the company's silver coins had remained aboard the wreck, the very cargo Cornelisz had planned the mutiny to steal. Divers recovered 10. 1 was pinned under a fallen cannon and couldn't be moved. Another had already been broken open. The mutineers themselves had gotten to it first and split the coins among themselves. Not even Cornelius's calculated greed managed to save the whole treasure. Everyone had been chasing that gold, including the men who were supposed to be guarding it.
The rest of Cornelius's accomplices were taken back to Batavia for further judgment. More were hanged there. Others received different punishments. Arian Jacobs, the skipper whose grudge against Pelsert had helped set the whole conspiracy in motion back on the open sea, was questioned under torture in Batavia too. He never confessed. Without a confession, and without direct proof he'd taken part in the killings themselves, there wasn't enough evidence to hang him, but nobody ever cleared him either. He simply disappears from the record after that. What little evidence survives suggests he died in a prison cell in Batavia.
Of the 341 people who'd left Texel almost a year earlier, only 122 ever reached their destination.
Rescue didn't mean the end of Lucretia Jantz's ordeal. Once back in Batavia, she was charged with inciting the violence, encouraging the killings, and being responsible, according to the court record, for deaths caused by her own duplicity. The court requested permission to question her under torture, the same method used on the killers themselves.
The woman who'd once been used as a pretext for someone else's mutiny was now being tried for taking part in a massacre she herself had survived as a victim. Lucretia denied everything. In the end, the company refused permission for torture, and the charges were dropped.
She walked free into a world that had already changed. Her first husband, sent by the company to Burma to buy slaves, had gone missing by then. Lucretia remarried, this time to an ordinary soldier, well below her social standing by the standards of the time, and returned to the Netherlands in 1635.
But her story wasn't forgotten. In 1645, 16 years later, the company officially banned women from sailing on its ships at all, deciding it was easier to remove women from its vessels entirely than to trust that men wouldn't do evil things over one of them. One survivor had changed the corporate policy of the largest trading company on Earth.
Pelsert never really recovered either. The ordeal broke his health, and somehow the disaster followed him, even though he was the one who delivered the survivors and the justice. The promotion within the company that had once seemed certain never came. A little over a year after the wreck, he died of illness during another expedition, leaving no children and no heirs. Most of what he'd earned in his life went back to the company he'd served, not to any family. Batavia's wreck sat on the seafloor for more than 3 centuries before a lobster fisherman stumbled on it by accident in 1963, tipped off by a writer who'd spent years piecing the ship's route together from archival records.
Excavations in the 1970s recovered around 20 tons of the wooden hull, nearly 4% of the original ship, an extraordinary haul for 17th century maritime archaeology.
Today, the ship's raised bow stands in the museum in Fremantle, Western Australia, alongside the skeleton of one of the massacre's victims, real human remains of a real person killed almost 400 years ago for being one mouth too many on an empty island. Hayes's fort still stands on West Wallaby, untouched. A full-size, working replica of Batavia, built using the same methods and tools as the original, is docked in the Netherlands today, as if a ship that wrecked almost 4 centuries ago had finally made it home.
Even Batavia's treasure still isn't fully accounted for. In 2022, a story surfaced in Australia about a diver who'd secretly taken coins from the wreck site back in the early 90s and kept them at home for 3 decades. He was only caught after moving to another state and trying to register the find legally. The coins were seized and returned to the government. Almost 400 years later, the wreck is still, slowly, giving back what it once took.
But the strangest part of this story isn't what's left of it. It's what happened to the story itself.
Just 5 months after the disaster, a book was already published in Amsterdam, based on Pelsart's own journal, with engravings showing every stage of the catastrophe. It went through 8 printings. People in the 17th century knew the story of Batavia about as well as the world would come to know the Titanic 300 years later. Maybe even better.
And then the story nearly vanished. No major film adaptation, no cult following. Just another Dutch ship, another distant tragedy, remembered by historians and forgotten by almost everyone else.
And even the little we do know is still being argued over. In May 2025, just over a year ago, an academic paper challenged an interpretation that had stood for nearly 400 years, that one calculating madman was to blame for everything. The new theory suggests something different, that it wasn't a single villain who planned the massacre, but ordinary people, pushed to the edge by hunger and desperation, who broke down one after another.
We may never know for certain who Geronimus Cornelisz really was, a cold-blooded psychopath, or simply the first person to break, dragging everyone else down with him. 3 centuries ago, this story horrified all of Europe. Today, there's only one truly dangerous reef left on these islands, and it hasn't been underwater for a long time. It's hiding in people who are certain nothing like this could ever happen to them.